Hello. So, once again, we meet to discuss a new topic from the course titled Encounters with History for Webster University. And previous lecture was sort of a finish line for the first half of the semester. I assume we already had midterm, and you guys are okay, perhaps not okay, with your marks. But today we're starting a new episode um, in our subject, and the second half of the semester begins with this lecture. We are going back to Asia, right? We already had a class on the first encounters of the Europeans with the people of Asia. Now we're going to talk about the rise of Indian nationalism. So, in the previous lecture, we discussed how the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch would then explore the opportunities that are offered by very lucrative Asian trade, something that has enriched these nations quite a lot. Um, and we have discussed how these European nations were not perhaps strong enough to compete with the local empires. So they would have to be satisfied with small chunks here and there, a certain naval base here, and the Dutch would then occupy the Spice Islands because there were no powerful centralized kingdoms over there. They were very fragmented. They were fighting one another, so sort of an easy prey for even such a small country as Netherlands back then, right? So, and the Dutch were able to take it. Same with Portugal, even smaller country with even smaller amount of people, who would be then tapping into the pre-existing trade. But today we're going to particularly focus on how did the British become one of the most dominant force in the region, and how this um, comparison, right, where the local empires would be more powerful, would be these progressive, very rich, and of course, quite powerful militarily speaking, countries would be, unmatched in power for the European countries that weren't able to provide significant presence in the region. And so, how did all of this change, and when did it change? So, colonialism is often viewed solely in terms of political conquest and exploitation, that we come, we conquer, we exploit the territory that we get through the conquest. However, the assertion of power by one group of people over the others, wholly beyond one's frontiers, involves much more than just a clash of arms. It's not just physical conquest, right? And it's not just a physical extraction of resources. It is a struggle over ideas, right? It is easy to conquer, but it is very hard to keep this territory. First things first, because you have limited, more often than not, you would have limited capabilities, a limited military presence, and you would not be able to send your troops immediately because that territory would be quite far away. How many troops would you be able to send? What happens if another colonial power, which, there's been a lot of competition happening in the game of colonialism, right? Happening ever since the 1500s kicked in. There's constantly some competition, right? And unlike the Portuguese and the Spanish that had papacy sort of set them apart and say, this is what you get, this is what you get, other powers, especially non-Catholic powers, weren't exactly happy with the idea of settling at a certain, settling with a certain division. Those powers felt they're more powerful and they deserve more, right? So they've been competing for influence, competing for money, most importantly. So how do you keep this territory? It's not just by military, by the use of force. It is more often than not, it will be ideas and colonial identities that would be formed, right? That would keep these people in line, because the local population would almost always be significantly larger than any of the military contingent you would have there. None of these countries were able to supply enough soldiers to drown any of these countries in blood and kill everybody. But it was just enough to keep the order, right? Especially given the context in which the colonization quite typically happened in terms of divide and conquer, or internal rivalries. And we're going to discuss that a little later. So yeah, this relationship between the subject peoples and the enlightened colonizers, leading to subjugation, was quite often cultural and political, not just military. Long after the battles for conquest have passed in history, the cultural legacies of former imperial societies linger on even after decolonization has happened. It shaped the lives throughout arts, literatures, both of former colonizer and the colonized people. This is particularly true to the nature and legacy of the 400-year-old encounter between the colonial and post-colonial Britain and India. Probably the best example of the impact and influence of that colonization on both the colonizer and colonized people. So in 1600s, at the early 1600s, Queen Elizabeth granted royal charter to the Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, which was later renamed East India Company, giving it a monopoly on English trade with India, China, and lands of Southeast Asia. Not long after, she dispatched an ambassador. His name is Sir Thomas Roy, and he went to Mughal Empire, then arguably the greatest empire of the day, formally to negotiate trade agreements. From that point, Roy learned that the Mughals, relatively recent by that moment in time, invaders from Central Asia, had pursued to indigenize their rule by engaging in cultural fusion. It was a unique fusion of Central Asian Muslim culture and the local Hindu culture, and they lived in sort of a balance and symbiosis with the locals. At first, the predecessors, the Delhi Sultanate, they quite oftenly would forcefully convert people into Islam because there were just so little of them. Even though that's prohibited in Islam, they would still do it because they were feeling threatened by the majority being represented by another nation. So they wanted strength in numbers. But with Mughal Empire, it was a lot more tolerant, like the Turks can do, right? It is, you pay jizya if you're not Muslim, and that's it. And we don't really care what you do. You preserve your religion, your culture, you're fine. As long as you are loyal. So they were very tolerant, and some of the highest officers of Muslim-ruled state were Hindus, and some Hindu princes were a part of this empire, had a lot of autonomy. Mughal art, architecture, music, and even food were a blend of Central Asian culture and South Asian element, and the South Asian culture. The Mughals hoped to solidify popular support by instituted administrative policies, which range from a form of checks and balances and separation of power, but they're not very well known in Europe, to a progressive taxation system that would be more effective and more fair to everybody within the empire. Roy was so impressed with the power and grandeur of the Mughal Empire and the diversity of the state that he advised his countrymen that they should look for prosperity in quiet trade, right, with respect to Mughal authority. So basically what that meant, do not cause any trouble, guys. We will not be able to do anything with them, and if we lose this opportunity, a lot of money will go to waste. Even worse, it will go to the French or go to someone else, to the Dutch or the Portuguese, right? This is a very nice opportunity. We need this, right? This sort of money is incredibly important for us. So this is the extent of the Mughal Empire, the largest territory that it has ever controlled. And as you can see, it occupies almost all the territory of India, with the exception of the outmost southern point of India, and also Ceylon, right, which is right now known as Sri Lanka. And also, they started out right here around Kabul, right? They started their expansion, but then sort of most of the territory that is here in blue was lost, but they've added quite a lot more, including the most important part, Bengal, right? Bengal is the richest territory of India, something that accounts for the majority of riches that India has ever held. So the merchants of East India Company initially complied with Roy's admonition, even though it forced them to show subservience to both Muslim officials and Hindu merchants. Remember from the I think it was lecture number 3, we should remember at least, that the both Muslims and Hindus did regard Europeans as inferior civilization thanks to their problematic encounters with the Portuguese, and also a lot of bad history in terms of military rivalry between Christianity and Islam, especially in the Indian Ocean, where The Christians would quite often pirate the ships of Arab merchants, peaceful merchants. The Portuguese pioneering in that, of course. But the Hindus also regarded foreigners as like us, right? The people so low in the hierarchy that they're actually outside of traditional caste system, the outsiders. Right now, the outsiders, these sort of outsiders, would be called untouchables, right? And they would typically refer to it would typically relate to the people who work with dead bodies or in some unclean professions, somebody you are not supposed to touch or deal with in any way. That's how the Europeans have been portrayed. Uh, there is some truth to that, right? There is some substance to that sort of treatment because English, as all the other Europeans, rarely based. They thought it was induced influence, especially in 1600s, in early 1600s. Later on, it was a little different, but then the relationship between them was already also different as well. So they believed that washing would induce influenza, and lacking toilet paper, they had to improvise quite oftenly. This is why you would have long capes, right? And in Europe, the fashion quite often would be dictated by the unclean surroundings. Let's say the heels, right? High heel shoes would be particularly because there'd be pardon my French, shit everywhere, right? Because people would just empty their night pots right out the window wherever it goes. Just beware, right? It's not my problem if it gets on you. So hence the wide hats that would protect you. You get some crap on your head, you just throw it away, right? You get something on your on your cape, you throw it away, right? Again, the high heels also because you'd be walking literally ankle deep in crap. So yes, not the best place to live back then. Um, and to be more frank, Europeans at the time smelled and looked unclean because of that. Again, fragrance, perfume, scents, right, to hide the smell. All of that, was to a big distaste on the part of the Muslims or particularly the Hindus, who had long history and a long culture, very profound culture of bathing and bathhouses. So yeah, they believed them to be inferior to Indians and to Muslims, and not to jeopardize the commerce. The British had, at the initial stages of the encounter, just like all the other Europeans, they had to sort of be subservient and agree to this role. So this is the Mughal royalty dinner, just to illustrate that it was quite lavish, and typically there'll be tons of people there. So they had money. It was a rich, rich empire. However, two factors altered relative position of the English and their Indian hosts. The first was the slow decline of the centralized authority of the Mughal Empire. While it was while the first encounters with Europeans, with the Portuguese and others happened, Mughal Empire was at its rise. It was super powerful, so there was no way there would be any colonization or any kind of conquest happening. So by being powerful during that time, they have particularly preserved themselves from being colonized by anyone else. But they started to decline along the way with British rising and becoming more powerful. They're gaining competitive advantage over everybody else, and all of a sudden the British become the leading force of colonization. They start colonizing former empires that everyone else was afraid of dealing with, at least by force. So with each passing generation, Mughal emperors would slowly abandon their policy of religious toleration in favor of more fundamentalist Islamic agenda, which would poison the relationship with Hindu people. It also exhausted the empire's revenues by profligate monument building, including beautiful but very pricey Taj Mahal, which is, again, a lot of people, you'd be surprised, guys, but a lot of people don't know that Taj Mahal is a mosque, right? People think it's a palace. A lot of people, like in Europe and US, would think that's a palace. And they also engaged in many ill-advised wars, including a futile attempt to conquer Afghanistan, which all you know from history is impossible to conquer. Fed up with Mughal maladministration, allies sought autonomy within the empire, broke away to establish their own states, which then began to fight among themselves. And the collapse of Mughal centralized authority left subcontinent vulnerable to foreign invasion, provided a motive, or at least a rationale for foreign conquest. And surprisingly, the British stepped in. Not even the British Crown, but the British corporation called East India Company. That's one of the first countries in the world to be conquered not by the state, by a corporation. But we're going to get back to that real soon. The second factor was the increasing aggressiveness of EC. It was associated with England. It was that corporation that originally received the permission from the royal court to trade and represent the trade interest of the British Crown. And that's what they did. And basically, a corporation, it's as if Apple Corporation would decide to go and wage a war against someone. In the mid-1600s, the largely Protestant English experienced a religiously colored civil war at home and initiated the brutal subjugation of their Catholic neighbor Ireland, which has made them basically Great Britain, right? They've started to expand and started to become that sort of a, empire, right? Colonial empire after that. These events, of course, have shaped deep-rooted prejudices against everybody non-Protestant and non-Anglo-Saxon. So even against Catholics, right, against the average Catholics, they have a lot of built-up prejudices and intolerance. So guess what happened when they saw people who are even more diverse? This is basically the roots of further English imperialism and nationalism. At this time, England engaged in war with the EC's rivals in Asia, including the Dutch, who had largely succeeded in driving merchants out of the Southeast Asia's enormously profitable Spice Islands, but that was it. They were only able to hold the Spice Islands, and they understood that they cannot expand any further because they would be, stretched thin, and they could not afford to lose the Spice Islands, which were insanely profitable. Turmoil at home and abroad, English rulers thought to generate more wealth by allowing other British trading companies to compete with the EC's Asian markets. Within India, the decline of the Mughal authority exposed the merchants to attacks associated with anti-Mughal rebellions and to what the company deemed harassment by newly emergent Mughal successor states, who quite naturally sought to impose their own taxes on European traders. So none of that was okay for the British merchants, and they decided to act. And the combination of that decline and the rising British imperial ambitions, rising prejudice against the inhabitants of the world beyond Britain, and unprecedented commercial competition influenced the EC directors to take an increasingly bolder stance in relation with Indian rulers. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth was so sweet and had written to the Mughal court conveying her admiration to the emperor. But just 154 years later, the British had come to view the remnants of the empire as ripe for the taking. Moreover, they also started to associate these people with backward people, right? People who are static, unable to develop and progress, and largely started to be the foundation of future racism and nationalism that has driven the British to perceive their colonial subjects as unworthy. They also started to fight with their own with the rivals, especially with France. For British people, the France was, of course, as the leader of continental Europe, that was the biggest opponent back then. And the French have been quite successful in Southeast Asia. So if history would turn differently, they would also have India as well. But British were lucky this time. The French pursued a strategy in India of playing rival Indian states one against another, but not mastering it well enough. They've actually made a lot of enemies rather than having allies that they can pit one against another and then just finish them off quickly. They did the opposite. They became enemies to everyone. And the British were a little more sophisticated in their diplomacy, and the British interests have pushed the agents of EEC even further, right, to be even more active, and they turned the strategy against the French and later used it to siege much of southern Asia, or southern India, or southern Asia. In 1757, the richest province of India, Bengal, fell victim to the EEC's intrigues, and this has exactly what identified the victory of the British, because Bengal is one of the richest places in India, which has financed the further conquest. The British were literally paying locals to fight in the armies, and actually they were conquering India by the hands of Indians. It is incredible how they've used local resources to pay off local people, to enroll them into military, into the British service, and then conquer their own territory with their own hands. Incredible. European trained armed Indian army, which was consisting both of Hindu and Muslim people. They gained control of much of South Asia, and in process, two-fifths of the Indian subcontinent, deemed lacking in commercial value, was left in the hands of politically subordinated Indian princes. So about 35-ish%. The early Orientalists, right? This is what happens. The British power establishes itself, but originally it wasn't the British crown that was ruling and managing the colony. Upon gaining India as a colony, it was mostly managed by EC, right? Because the British crown had other things to do, apparently. And when the influence started to spread the subcontinent, the contact with its inhabitants intensified. Warren Hastings was one of the most influential officers of EC of his time, and he has spent much of his life in India and was impressed by the richness of Indian culture. His interest was shared by a few other EC officers in Bengal, and through the collective study of Sanskrit, the ancient Indian sacred language, they have established the existence of what thereafter became known as Indo-European family of languages, which included Greek, Latin, Persian, Germanic, Roman languages, which is French, Italian, Spanish, and English. Literally the same people, right? Because originally people have gone from Iran to India, and also from there they went to Europe, basically, right? So we have one foundation for all of our diverse cultures, basically. That's what that means. For them, it was very important. Also, on the note that originally at the first stage they had to be in a lot of contact with inhabitants, it was quite easy to explain because the road was very dangerous. The naval technologies weren't perfect, so it took them anything from several months to half a year to travel back home. So imagine you cannot go there for a break, right, or for holidays. You basically, if you want to work at EC, build your career there, you're stuck there for 5, 10, 20 years. If you're a male, what do? Right? And typically women wouldn't go. So, because again, would be perceived dangerous, etc., etc. They would stay with kids. But if you go there as a young, ambitious person, what do? You get yourself a wife from locals, obviously. Who else, right? So this is how the British people would actually be merging with locals, right? Would be mixing with locals. There would be mixed ethnicities, kids that would then go into British military, and they, by the way, would be very, very privileged, but being half-seas. In this sense, incredibly close connections, and this is why when those connections have been so close, there was a lot more respect and a lot more interest in the relationship between the EC and the locals. Right, and the people, the EC people, didn't quite always live in like secluded quarters. They would quite often live among others, so there would be a lot more cultural exchange. So such work that they've done, that these people have done, led to the study of the sacred Upanishads, right, the ancient Indian philosophical texts that have been almost directly provided by the Aryans that came from Iran. The Upanishads suggested that Hinduism possessed an underlying rationalism with the concept of a single divine spiritual consciousness, regardless of having multiple gods. Right? This idea very much appealed to Westerners who have been inclined to reject the ritual sacrifices and polytheism of contemporary Indian society as morally debased. But it now appeared to them that all of the things that they don't like about Hinduism, like again, sacrifices or polytheism, is sort of like it's a build-up on an unfortunate build-up on the very true ancient, great, beautiful ancient culture that we share. And we've built Christianity on top of that, and they've built Hinduism on top of that. So they've looked at this as a potential chance to westernize them, to educate them, and to civilize them, to bring them back to their roots, right, to the foundation of their culture that they shared with, with the Greeks and, with everybody, basically. These discoveries won financial backing of wealthy British aristocrats who quite oftenly, during, the Renaissance, they wanted to appeal to the antiquity, and that was very, not the Renaissance, Enlightenment, right? During the Enlightenment, they would be it would be incredibly fashionable to be the patron of anything that would be relevant to either ancient Greek or ancient Roman, and that was something that they've seen connection with, right, with those ancient Greek and ancient Roman cultures. The Enlightenment, like the Renaissance before, it had been inspired by Greek and Roman philosophy, so this is why it was so sensitive to them, so interesting and appealing to them. British scholars of the Enlightenment were eager to study the culture that was certainly connected and possibly influenced by this great role model of Greco-Roman world. Those who pursued this course of study were called Orientalists, which meant the students of Eastern knowledge, which was originally okay, and only then became derogatory. It's not derogatory. It became to have a negative, started to have a negative connotation. So in this sense, given the decline of the centralized Mughal authority, most Orientalists started to see their own culture as superior to that of India in its current state. So the more powerful the British Empire began to feel itself, and the more success it had in the colonization arena, the more the people started to have those imperialistic feelings of self-worth and superiority. So some Orientalists went further, holding that even if Europeans were presently superior to India materially, Indians were not inferior to Europe spiritually and philosophically. One such thinker was Charles Stuart, the general major of EC. His life among Hindus and his close study of Indian religion and philosophy, despite everybody around him becoming more and more imperialistic and less tolerant, he believed that he's seen the parallels between Krishna and Jesus Christ, whose teachings were depicted in the most popular piece of sacred Indian literature, the Bhagavad Gita. Stuart also drew attention to the great similarities in the divine instructions given by Jesus and by Krishna. Both stressed love of God as the vehicle of salvation. So he was like, I don't believe that they're debased people, but as a person and alongside his allies in the company, they believe that the way to handle this, then, given that these people are basically us, but a wayward brother, long lost, but now we've gotten him back. So what do we do with them, right? Let's re-educate them, let's re-civilize them, and integrate them into this, into the civilization that we are as British people, as the leading European power that we represent. So at this moment in time, the interest of the British Parliament has been drawn to India because of the loss of Americas in the American Revolution. They lose a very profitable colony. They're in distress. The empire politically is in turmoil, and Britain has emerged from its wars with monarchical and then revolutionary France as the world's most efficient state and leading military power, but it was greatly divided on social and political issues. The heel of this divide would then to be, William Pitt would designate India to be the heel for this divide, basically, right? He decided to shift focus from the internal affairs to the imperialist expansion in imperial culture as a very nice way to shift the attention of people from how shitty that is to live in London of the late 1700s, early 1800s. To avoid culture war at home, they sought to use India as a distant and thus safe social political laboratory, basically, for addressing ideas such as the relationship between us and secular state, rising Christian evangelicalism, and etc., etc. The company had no desire to have its administration troubled in this manner, and they started to enter into conflicts with the British Crown more often than before. But the British government gradually transferred to itself the power to do so, downgrading EC from quite an autonomous association to just the institutional mechanism. The weight upon India's parliament growing influence over EC rule in India was immediately felt. Its society was to be remade in the pursuit of agenda most clearly expressed by James Mill in his immensely successful three-volume History of India. And needless to say, Mill has never been to India, right, but has written 3 tomes about its history. Mill argued that rather than studying Indian culture, as the early Orientalist urged, the West should be teaching India Western culture. So from those quite progressive ideas of the early Orientalists that would go on to this. And trust me, in the eyes of the person of 21st century, substituting local Indian culture with Western culture seems barbaric and very illiberal, but this is what I would call a liberal approach, because the alternative was a lot more gloomy and, not something that we would ever be able to justify. So yeah, they had a very simple idea, right? They believe that right now they're staying at the barbarian stage. Unfortunately, but what do? Let's give them European knowledge. That was liberal in a sense that it would liberate them from colonialism. At the end, that was the great idea. Mill's work basically was, of course, very racist, based on and was advocating white supremacy, basically, and very much in line with the phenomena called social Darwinism, which has nothing to do with actual teachings of Darwin. It is something that's a pseudoscientific concept that the advocates of white supremacy would quite often use, saying that if the species become stronger in the state of nature when competing, then the races do the same. So the white race is obviously what they would say is the fittest race out there because we go around conquering people. That would ignore, of course, so much anything that what history teaches, anything that all the scientific knowledge. But who cared, right? That was the time where people tried to create philosophies that would justify imperialism. They would be in search of such quasi-scientific ideas. So among the prominent Indian reformers, we would find Thomas Babington Macaulay. He had serious doubts about the morality of surrendering India to British rising imperial impulse. So this is again why I call it liberal, because these people would be supporting leftist, right? They would be supporting the liberal side of parliament, and typically that would mean a totally different, a more fairness-oriented approach and more freedom-oriented approach when it comes to the imperial variant. So what did they offer? What was the plan that I mentioned? While treating the Indians and indoctrinating them into the European knowledge, they basically wanted to anglicize them by making the English official language, making British culture to be the dominant culture, and replacing Sanskrit and replacing all the aspects of their native culture and civilization by the contributions from the British culture. What they wanted to achieve is to create generations of Indian people who would be Indian in blood, so ethnically Indian, brown of skin, but English in taste and sensibility. So you would have brown British people. That's not what I was, as horrible as it sounds, right? As racist as it might sound, they would want to make these people British by issuing them this English identity, not even British, English identity, to be fair. Britain's goal was, according to Macaulay, to completely transfer its more efficient way of life to Indians, as to ensure that India would eventually become a well-governed, independent state free of British dominance and control, because it wouldn't be needed, since these are the British people, basically. These are brothers by identity, by the principle of identity, right? They would be our natural allies with everything we do, and a perfect market for liberal economy, meaning that and ESC was always the proponent of fostering and developing the principles of liberal economy, right? Liberal trade. And that was something that they wanted to do. Ideally, there would be a separate state that would govern itself. You wouldn't be responsible for it, but it would be an almost guaranteed market for your goods. And for Britain, that was one of the most important elements of its colonial structure. You would be receiving an ally, great profits, and you'd have more British people basically in the world. So that's a win-win scenario. As Macaulay foresaw, Britain would prosper more by trade, guided by westernized Indian elites with the principles of liberal trade and economy, than by Indian-born slaves. His ideas attracted the support of liberals again in Britain, who favored open economic competition and progressive expansion of civil liberties at home. In 1833, Macaulay had numbered among liberal reformers and one of the most influential liberal reformers who forced changes in the EC's charter that included the right of Indians to enter into government of their own country. But they could make little headway against the rising tide of self-interested British imperialism. So they also suggested that it's the the Indians, right? Obviously, the local Indians that are supposed to be ruling and taking decisions about their own homeland. Very progressive for that time, guys. Most Brits believed if India was to be reformed, this would be done via the direct intervention of British administrators and missionaries from home, not by slow evolutionary exposure to Western political education and, leading to Indian self-administration. A lot of the people who are plagued and poisoned by the idea of colonialism and imperialism, they would believe that the color of the rulers in Britain should be white, and these people should be born in Britain, right? Not the locals. And then once valued, honored officers of Indian Army who might have been fully Hindu or Muslim or partially would be mixed race, all of them lost their privileges and have been losing those privileges along the way. People as well, and the British coming there would also start to live separately. The encounters with locals would be limited to a minimum, and larger changes soon followed. Inspired by Mill's condemnation of traditional society in India, British missionaries brought pressure on the British government to criminalize or abolish many traditional Indian customs and rites and religious practices. Chief among those was the attempt to curtail the rare practice of sati. This is burning a young widow with her husband on the funeral pyre, the deceased husband, obviously, to avoid any subsequent behavior that might otherwise bring discredit on the name. British evangelical leaders would pressure EC to end this practice, and also the Christian missionaries would quite often try to convert these people, saying that if you convert to Christianity, you don't have to do this. Although it wasn't very successful. This is the picture of a sati ritual, wife literally burning on pyre with her husband, but that only was relevant to the more traditional families and more higher ranking families, not all the families in India. And the liberal approach basically lost all of its value in the eyes of British people by 1857. Even the most hardcore liberals stopped having any arguments in support of it and weren't able to propel that into Parliament, simply because in 1857, Great Mutiny happened. It is sort of a revolt, an attempt to revolt from both Muslim and Hindu population in the aftermath of a great misunderstanding, which has resulted in a lot of death and incredible violence on both sides, on the part of the both sides. So what just happened was that humidity, India, a lot of humidity. Gunpowder doesn't like humidity, so in order to preserve guns and ammunition, the British would then take cartridges filled with ammo. They would take that and they would wrap it in paper. They would then use pork fat. They would drip it in pork fat and also beef fat, right? So those cartridges would be then rolled into this paper with beef and pork fat. And the way you should take that off to use the cartridge in battle would be to bite off the paper, right? A piece of paper that will be sticking out. You bite it off, you put it in the rifle, it's good to go. The problem is, both Hindu and Muslim cultures and religion, you cannot eat beef on the part of the Hindus and pigs on the part of the Muslims. Haram, right? Mass dismissals of Indian troops unwilling to use these new cartridges has led to incredible tensions within the army. They stopped obeying orders, and in the military, if you stop obeying orders, you get punished, which has caused the Muslims and the Hindus to even enrage even more. And eventually, the fighting started. They started killing one another, and the EC people, the few British that have been there, they were in trouble, right? This is Indian sepoy soldiers. This is typically the soldiers that will be conquering India itself for the British. This is the picture of sepoy mutiny. The British obviously won. Several factors saved them from being absolutely and completely expelled from the subcontinent. Along the coastlines and near the major port cities, Indian commercial elites were benefiting from being the port of that empire, the colonial British Empire, a lot more than they rationally calculated that we should stay with the British. Then minorities also decided that they don't have anything to share with neither the Hindus nor the Muslims, so they should stick with the British. So yeah, and Muslims and last but not least, Muslims and Hindus did not exactly cooperate. This is something that allowed British to soak around as many soldiers as they could. They were a lot more organized, better organized. They were the backed recruits from ethnic and religious minorities. The response was swift, but it was accompanied by horrific reprisals as thousands of captured mutineers were executed with excessive brutality. That was an answer to similar brutality that the Hindus and Muslims have been having against the British population. Of course, no one in Britain would know about what the British did in return. But everybody would know about the brutality of Muslims and Hindus simply because the newspapers would propel that, and that will be one of the greatest arguments in hands of the imperialists, right? Um, the right side of the parliament. So basically, the Great Mutiny has been labeled as the full responsibility of EC, and it has British government has blamed EC for this and has disbanded the company. Instead of having this as an instrument, the British started to directly control the colony, and this is when the imperialist approach kicks in, right? And the end, it's a complete end to any of the great ideas and strategies that the liberals had in mind. Uh, so the selective memory of the brutality of the late war, shaped by the spread of wartime photographic images, has basically led to the continued denial of any significant political rights to Indians. And unlike the liberals, the imperialists supported the idea of not having Indians in any positions of significance. They could be running, they could be working as clerks, sometimes lawyers, doctors, but at a very, very low level of government administration. Nothing more than that. Every significant position would be occupied by the white British people. And this is something that would plague the entirety of the other 50 years of colonial presence of the British in India. One of the few lessons accepted, however, by the Great Mutiny was that the British understood that you should probably stop trying to abandon the. You should stop trying to interfere in Indian or Muslim religion, and you should also know what you're dealing with, because the liberals were like, we are rebuilding them as a British, you know, civilization sort of. So why would we care about what Indian culture right now, contemporary Indian culture has? What peculiarities are there, or Muslims, right? So in this sense, they would disregard any cultural uniqueness, right? Any cultural traits that the local population has. The imperialists would give at least that much to them, but they would continue to reshape Indian culture and society by less direct means, and I would even say, well, less direct, but more painful. The Western idea of private ownership, for instance, would be introduced, taking away the small degree of protection these poor people had. Before that, it would raise more flexible, gender-neutral, traditional communities with the rights and privileges given to women as well as men, and etc., etc. British ideas about government non-interference in economic affairs were applied to India in a way that, in the result of that, caused millions of deaths due to famine, and general cruelty in South India, especially from the 1970s up to 1900s, because the British government refused on ideological grounds to divert food to the worst affected areas, with a simple logic that they used also in Ireland, which has also led to the Irish potato famine. A large wave of migrants from Ireland going to US as a result of that. British rulers, despite the horrific example of the Irish potato famine, decided that the relief of famine was best left to the operation of a free market and should not be given to, it should not be government responsibility. Merchants, however, would disagree, because they would prefer to sell their goods for a better price internationally rather than to the poor, starving population of South India. The worst part was that they had food. It's just that people couldn't afford it, and they had to die from starvation. So, racism and the rise of Indian nationalism, we've already talked about this, guys. It's quite clear how this happened. But there were several factors that helped British become even more nationalistic, racist, and colonial and imperialistic. First off, the opening of Suez Canal and the dropping, the ever lowering power of Ottoman Empire has significantly increased the efficiency of travel to India. So because of the Suez Canal, they could now go to London in a matter of a couple of weeks. So you could be, you could go there for a small vacation and be back without having to give up your position. That also means that you don't need to you don't need to live, if you're young, you don't need to find the wife among the locals. You can bring her with you. Travel is now very safe. You can bring your kids. You can settle there in a very nice, secluded area that will be exclusively for expats, for the British, right, for the white people. These improved means of travel accelerated the arrival of British women, as already said. They brought around domesticity and thus reinforced the growing concept that the Brits in service to India were sacrificially bringing civilization to the heathen locals. Both factors contributed to the near apartheid social relation between Brits and Indians that, to some degree, long persisted and ultimately helped fuel Indian nationalism for years and years. They would be these secluded areas, specifically for the white British, would be um, uh, they would be specifically reserved only for the white people. There would be bars and other establishments that no local could go in. It's only for the white people. So does resemble similar politics in the United States of America during the segregation of the white and black population. Pretty much similar. Simply because they had this great infrastructure, they didn't need anything else. No reason to have any contact with the locals. Every major step taken by the British Indian administrators in the aftermath of the mutiny, from crushing and marginalizing traditional leaders like Hindu princes and Muslim Nawabs, to the establishment and enshrinement of racist policy that assumed Indian inferiority, sought to internally undermine British authority. With every step they took to diminish the value of the Hindu people within this colonial society, the more these people decided and understood the need to carve out a national state of their own. This encouraged the belief that many Western educated in India, educated elites, that uh, national identity, modern national identity, is within the reach. This outlook was reinforced by contemporary European developments, such as the rise of nationhood of Italy and then later Germany. This was complicated due to social and religious differences between various groups inside India, and Brits were quite proficient in using this in their favor, the racial and national and any other cultural divisions they'd be mastering them in order to make those colonial subjects more controllable. And because of that, Indians had to confront the traditional divisions by region, north versus south, as well as religion and ethnicity. Those who spoke for Indians' freedom also had to face challenges from both Hindu and Muslim fundamentalists and by many oppressed minority groups that would also be seeing little future in a secular state that would be either ruled by Muslims or the Hindus. India's answer to these difficulties was ultimately to be found in the eclectic political philosophy of the man who, more than any other single figure, guided South Asia in its path to independence. Mohandas Gandhi, like many other nationalist leaders, Gandhi was a British-trained lawyer who was admired as well as representing represented the British rule from childhood and had become as well versed in the work of the British and European in general philosophers and political thinkers, as well as in the local traditional texts and Hindu culture. I've been appealing to the heritage of the ancient Indian civilizations, to Ashoka the Great, the ideas of peace, peaceful non-violent resistance, etc., etc. So he decided that this is something that he could appeal to, and the choice of political identity and cultural identity here is crucial because this is how you make a country. Being a multi-ethnic society, a multi-confessional society, he needed to focus on something, and he chose this, and was quite successful in that. He was a law student in London. He was from a very privileged family. He was able to receive great education in London. He was surprised and delighted to find himself welcomed into the homes of the British men and women, a gesture that in British India you would not see normally, because the British people living in India would be secluding themselves as much as possible from the locals. He would see that these people are kind to him and are very interested in his culture. So he understood that it is not the people who are bad. It is not the British people by nature that are horribly racist. No, it is the people in India living in these conditions. These colonizers enter these certain realm and these conditions that force them, shape them as these people who hate locals all of a sudden because they're put into a position that kind of doesn't allow them anything else. So he decided that a great thing to do is to show people compassion and love instead of hatred. which would then be a lot stronger than pressing people with violence, hatred, or anything else. This is the picture of him. Unlike many who consider him to be like a great hero and a great historic figure, he was a very controversial figure, as it happens in history. If you're wondering what are the issues with Mahatma Gandhi, I do urge you guys to Google it. It is a very interesting thing to read. Certainly, great for your general knowledge, but we're not going to focus on that all too much. All we're going to talk about today is how he thought to accomplish um, independence. He decided that fighting against the British uh, would not be efficient, right? It would not. It would only give the British more pretext, right? More reasons to use force, just like in the Great Mutiny. So he thought that rightful civil disobedience against government sports and injustice, just like in the United States of America, and the philosophy of ahimsa, nonviolence, was the key to success. And through the synthesis of his ideas, he called satyagraha, Gandhi created a tool for disciplined but non-violent political action designed to persuade the oppressor to accept the truth about the colonial injustices. In Gandhi's view, violence against the oppressor merely enabled him or her to justify their own violent behavior. Nonviolent resistance not only removed this completely, but offered open arms to the oppressor, bringing back the love. Gandhi's appeal attracted the support of liberals in Britain and the world over as well, because after the World Wars, Britain was losing its position as the leading empire, the most powerful country in the world. Right about this moment in time, it was about the Soviet Union and the United States of America recarving the world for themselves. And this world had no place for colonies. Britain was, of course, it was the country that was severely depressed economically after the war. So, of course, didn't have a lot of opportunities to resist that movement and eventually had to let India go. However, Winston Churchill, being an imperial minded politician, has set a horrible, has put horrible seeds of self destruction onto the ground in form of weird border demarcation between the Muslim part, Pakistan, and India, which we know as Kashmir, which has been the point of tensions in this region for years and years, decades and decades, thanks to this, thing that British people typically do when they leave their former colonies. Um, the consequences of this British decolonization still grew conflict there, and doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. The conclusion is very simple. There have been different approaches, and the attitude of the British towards the Indians have been changing alongside with their rising power and success on the colonial arena. And from genuine interest to the Indian culture, they've gone to deny the Indian culture, completely deny the people, deny the right of those people to rule themselves. And the only thing that they would do, instead of having liberal economy do its thing and the trade bringing benefits to the empire, instead of that, they would taxate them. Instead of trade, taxation, and extractionism. The resources, the railroads, all of that would be going to the port cities and then be exported straight to Great Britain in order then to sell the goods at triple the price to the Indians, at expense of their own taxes. And they would even brag about how high are the tax payments in India. This is one of the things that has impoverished Indian population significantly to the point that many people would be selling their children into basically slavery simply because they needed money to pay for taxes. And that was it. They basically bled India dry. And that was the extent and the only plan that the imperialists ever had for India. So India received independence, but at what cost? This is your homework. There's just 3 questions we're going to discuss, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, only 3. So with the videos, I would particularly advise you guys to watch this one, the second video. There's also one I'll be adding, and you should watch that as well. The slide will look a little different, so the one that I'll add, you should watch. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you next week.